Thank you for inviting me to speak to your conference of teachers and educators. I'm honored to be able to share my perspectives, both as an author and as a former teacher of ages 10 to 14. My journey to authorship began when I was a child growing up in the industrial Midwest of the United States. I was an avid reader and lucky to live close to two public libraries that I visited several times a week. Beginning at a very early age, I started to imagine creating my own books, inspired by the ones I read. Although I didn't know any authors, I dreamed of being one someday, somehow. When I was 9 years old, I turned a small bedroom closet into my own writing space, and I used to sit among the clothing and the coats to write my stories and poems. But in my wildest childhood dreams, I don't think I ever imagined that one day my work would reach around the globe and connect with all of you, readers and teachers and friends in Turkey. I'm so grateful to have my most recent book, Rare Bird, translated into the Turkish language by Azaid Aslan. It's a story about a young boy named Joey who's an outsider, an outcast in his school, until a girl who's a few years older than he is discovers his surprising gift of being able to visualize the world from above, from a bird's eye view. Eventually, Joey's unique perspective and his artistic gifts change his life and his school and his community forever. Rare Bird was inspired by the experiences of my own nephew, who struggled both socially and academically in school. Like Joey in the novel, my nephew used to draw designs in the dirt of his school playground as a way to cope with his loneliness. And here's an example of one of his artworks. As you can see from the photograph, which is intended to be seen from above, it's an image which conveys both his feelings of isolation and his hopeful imagination. I know that all of us have had students like Joey. They are those quiet, overlooked, but very unique students who exist on the margins of our classrooms. With my book, I wanted to give a voice to the potential of those special rare birds who can expand our teaching and transform our perspectives as teachers. Rare Bird is my 7th book for ages 10 to 14. And I'm often asked how I made the journey from teaching to authorship and why I chose to leave teaching to write books. Well, first let me say I don't think you ever leave teaching. It's in your heart. I come from a family of educators and I will always be one. I couldn't write books for young people today without having had the experience of teaching young people first. As a teacher, I gained firsthand experience in writing for youth because I saw which stories captured my students' imaginations and interest and which ones didn't. I noticed the topics that were widely covered and the ones that were missing from the shelves. And I began to see that it was hard to find books for some of my students, especially books for teen boys with strong heroes of color. I moved from teaching to writing so that I could begin filling in some of those gaps that I first noticed as a teacher and to give voice to those stories that seemed to be overlooked. For instance, I wrote a fiction novel for math teachers because I noticed that there weren't many reading options for math classrooms. I researched Black heroes in World War II in order to write a historical fiction book that would appeal to teen boys. I searched for writing ideas in the fields of art and music, again because I wanted to see more books for youth that incorporated the arts. As a teacher turned author, I see myself as a bridge between the worlds of writing and teaching, and I use my past teaching experiences every day to guide my writing. But you are the second half of that bridge because you're the critical link between the book and the reader. Years ago, I remember being invited to a school by a principal who said his teachers were frustrated at the fact that their students hated to write and scored very poorly on writing tests. They wanted some tips from me as a former teacher and as a current author on how to be more effective in teaching writing. When I sat down with the teachers, I asked them what books they were reading in their classes, and they gave me a puzzled look. Books? I repeated my question, what literature books are you reading with your students? What novels do you read aloud to them? And I was shocked when the teachers told me they only used textbooks with excerpts of stories. They didn't use chapter books or literature books in their classrooms. Well, no wonder their students struggled with reading and writing. They had no experience with real stories and holding those real books. I think teachers who share a passion for books and reading, who incorporate books into everything they do, they create students who are strong writers and readers themselves. And over the past 20 years, I've been fortunate to work with thousands of students and teachers as an author. So I'd like to share some of my suggestions for how to build the strongest reading bridges in your classroom. First of all, I would say read aloud. No matter what grade level you teach, I encourage you to set aside 10 minutes every day to read aloud to your students and savor the reading experience with them. Choose books that you enjoy, or as the playwright George Bernard Shaw once said, make it a rule never to give a child a book you would not read yourself. As you are reading aloud, point out beautiful, well-written passages to your students. Savor satisfying scenes with them. Laugh together at the funny parts. I believe reading should be a shared community activity, not a solitary one. And read alouds are especially important for those students who don't come from reading households. And you can read aloud to any age group. When I was in university, one of my literature professors used to begin every class by reading to us from a favorite novel. And even as university students, as 20-year-olds and 21-year-olds, we loved being read to. So remember, you're the bridge to reading joy. Second, I would say focus on the process. I encourage you to look at books, not as a product, but as a process. And throughout the process of writing a book, authors make thousands of choices. If you want to have a deeper reading discussion, ask your students more about the process and the choices rather than the product. For instance, instead of asking, what is the most suspenseful part of the story, ask your students, how did the author build suspense? And that will lead to a deeper discussion. Instead of asking, who is the main character in this story, ask, why do you think the author chose this character as the primary character instead of another one? And what difference would it have made if they chose a different voice or a different character? When I visit classrooms as an author, I love it when readers ask me how and why I made certain choices in my books, why I give janitors important roles in nearly all of my stories, and why is redemption a major theme in all of my writing? If you focus on why and how questions, you'll get at the heart of a book and the heart of an author. And third, I would encourage you to write from the book. Use literature books as your writing inspiration, your springboard, your gold mine. When I was a child writer, I drew inspiration from my own stories from the books that I read. I wrote sequels to favorite series. I borrowed favorite characters from books and wove them into my own childhood creations. I encourage you to use books in that same way, as a bridge to creative writing in your classroom. Ask your students to rewrite the opening scene of a book or the closing scene. Create a new character to add into a story. Or imagine a scene in the book that didn't happen. One of my favorite activities is to take a suspenseful paragraph or two from a published book, write out the sentences on separate slips of paper, and then have your students experiment with rearranging them to build suspense or reduce it. Play with the sentences as you might play with a lump of clay, and see what it teaches you about the choices that authors make. As an author, I love it when readers use my words and characters to inspire their own writing. So let literature books be your bridge to teaching writing. And in closing, I'd like to share a note I received from a 10-year-old reader this week. His name is Elijah, and his note said, "I love your book because it felt like you were in the book when the teacher read it to us." That's the highest form of praise a teacher and an author can receive. I felt like I was in the book. Take the time to step inside the pages of a book with your students, and I believe you will change their lives.